Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. Here we are again on this long-running series that I've been doing. I've been watching the show Thriller with Boris Karloff from 1960 and 1961, and I've been doing a video every now and then talking about them in 6-episode chunks because there were a really lot of episodes. So, I'm kind of doing them a little bit at a time. So the one that we're doing today, we're actually going to talk about episodes 13 through 18. So let's just get right into it. So episode 13 is called Knock 312. And this was another kind of crime-heavy episode, and this was actually pretty entertaining. It didn't really have any major twists, and it was pretty easy to see where the story was going, but other than that, it was still pretty fun. It was directed by Herman Hoffman and was actually adapted from a novel by Frederick Brown, who, incidentally, also wrote a novel called The Screaming Mimi, which was not only adapted into a 1958 film starring Anita Ekberg, but was also the unofficial inspiration for Dario Argento's classic 1970 giallo film, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. So in this episode, the main character's name is Ray Kenton, and he's played by Joe Moross. He's a liquor salesman, and he has a gambling problem. And at the beginning of the story, he actually owes $1,500 to some people that have implied that they're gonna ice him if he doesn't come up with the loot in 24 hours. Now, his long-suffering wife, Ruth, who's played by the awesome Beverly Garland, who's absolutely fantastic here, she works as a waitress, and she's been socking away money in her own separate savings account, probably wisely so. Now, up to this point, she used to be kind of more of a pushover, lending money to Ray whenever he got in a jam, but she's pretty understandably tired of him constantly pissing her cash away on gambling debts. And even though she still has $4,000 in the bank, which I looked it up, and that would be the equivalent to almost 40 grand today, so that's a nice chunk of change. She's kind of decided at long last that she's going to put her foot down and not give her husband any more money, even though he tries pretty much every trick in the book to kind of try to guilt the cash out of her. I gotta say that I love Beverly Garland anyway, so I was really rooting for her this whole time to just to shut the bum down. And so I was kind of hoping she wouldn't backslide, and she didn't. So, girl came through for me, so I was really happy about that. So there are two other plot tendrils that play into the story as it goes on. The first of these actually involves a serial killer who's been stalking the city. And at this point, he's murdered 4 women by strangling them with silk stockings. Ray actually, the gambler guy, he actually sees the guy one night, as the killer is leaving the scene of his latest crime, but he doesn't realize that the guy is the serial killer until he has a revelation later on in the story. Then there's Benny, who's actually played by Warren Oates, who's been in a fuck ton of stuff. I've seen him everywhere. He's he plays this sort of mentally challenged newspaper seller, he runs a kiosk, and he's convinced himself that he's the murderer, even though there's no way that he possibly could be, because hundreds of people saw him at work when the murders took place, stuff like that. He confesses to the police pretty much on the daily that he's the killer, and he doesn't understand why nobody will believe him. And the cops have actually tried to help him out. Everybody kind of is sympathetic toward him because they know that he has issues. So they've tried to get him help by setting him up with a police psychiatrist, but he stops going. He's well, the psychiatrist doesn't believe me either, and he just absolutely refuses to be dissuaded from his delusions that he's actually the murderer. So we have a guy who desperately needs money and whose wife won't give it to him. We have a guy who erroneously thinks that he's a serial killer, and we have an actual serial killer whose identity actually becomes clear to the first guy about halfway through the story. So from those pieces, you can probably start to put together the puzzle of the plot that Ray comes up with to keep his gambling debts from getting him whacked. Now, this one did have some slow spots and was sort of predictable, once it started to play out, but all of the acting was still damn good, and I really did enjoy this one overall. Beverly Beverly Garland, like I said, really elevated it for me. I love her. And she played a great character here. She was like really she's tough, but like also really, really sympathetic at the same time. So she was easily like the best part of this episode for me. Episode 14 is called Man in the Middle. Now, this one was directed by Fletcher Markle, who is a very prolific director and producer who, fun fact, was married to legendary actress Mercedes McCambridge, who horror fans will know as the voice of Pazuzu in The Exorcist. And this was also based on a novel by Charlotte Armstrong, who also wrote the novels that the earlier Thriller episodes that I already talked about, The Mark of the Hand and Girl with a Secret, were based on. So this is the third one so far. Man in the Middle was kind of like almost a noir style, like crime thriller, which was sort of like diverting enough, I guess. But I will say that like some of the characters in this made just bafflingly dumb decisions, which led to less than ideal outcomes for everyone involved. The third act did have some really good tense moments, though. So Mort Saul plays this sort of sad sack TV writer guy named Sam Lynch. Now, at the beginning of the story, he's in a restaurant, bar, diner situation, and he overhears the two guys in the booth behind him very casually like planning to abduct a well-known local heiress for ransom and possibly kill her if that becomes necessary. Now, granted, I am not a kidnapper or a murderer myself, but I would imagine that if you and your associates are arranging this kind of scheme, it might behoove you to, you know, like maybe hash out the details in a more private location, like your own damn house, for example, rather than going out and blabbing the whole shebang at normal volume in a very, very public place. Maybe I just don't understand crime. I don't know, but I'm just saying. So Sam is spotted by these two miscreants, whose names are Baby Hoffman, who's played by Julian Burton, and Mr. Clark, who's played by Werner Kemperer, aka Colonel Klink from Hogan's Heroes. So I thought that was pretty cool. So basically what he does is Sam like loudly tells a bartender this story about saving a dog from getting run over, which is kind of like the moral of the story is meant to imply to the kidnappers that he isn't going to squeal on them. They acknowledge his message, but subtly also let it be known that he's toast if he goes to the cops. At this point, again, hey kidnappers, maybe next time don't tell your plans to the whole damn restaurant and this kind of stuff wouldn't happen to you. So just a pro tip. So anyway, Sam starts thinking about this heiress, whose name is Kay Salisbury, and she's played by Sue Randall, who I think is best known for being on Leave It to Beaver. Although I knew her from somewhere, and I looked at her IMDb, and nothing that was on there like was all that familiar. And I was like, God damn, where have I seen her? But she was in a Twilight Zone episode, so maybe I know her from that. But a lot of the stuff that that she was in, like I didn't know, you know, I wasn't really familiar with. So I was just kind of like, well, I know, because I know she's like really familiar to me, but I couldn't figure it out. But she was on Leave It to Beaver for several episodes, but you know, I don't think I'm recognizing her from that because I haven't seen Leave It to Beaver since I was a kid. So anyway, so he starts thinking about this heiress who's going to get kidnapped. And even though he doesn't know her from Adam, or Eve, I guess, he decides that he's going to take a stand for once in his life and not be what he calls a fence sitter, like somebody who just keeps his mouth shut and lets bad things happen to innocent people. So he goes to the woman's father to warn him about this kidnapping plot, making it clear that like the two kidnappers will absolutely kill him if they find out that he ratted. But of course, dear old dad doesn't believe him. So then, this is what I mean about like bafflingly dumb decisions. So then Sam essentially kidnaps the woman himself, kind of. I mean, not kind of, he does. And hides her in a safe location. And things get more and more needlessly complex, mainly because of either Sam's inability to just very clearly state what he's up to, or other people's unwillingness to believe anything that he says. Now, things do actually work out more or less okay, but there was a bit of time there when I thought shit was going to go really, really badly. I did like the theme here of Sam deciding he was going to risk his own life to save someone he didn't know, just because he was, you know, tired of seeing bad people getting away with things. There was also like a little side message a little bit like about the heiress Kay and the privilege that her family's wealth afforded her. She kind of like acknowledges at the end that she basically never had to be what they called in the world because she was always insulated from evil because of her money. So she was almost glad that all this crazy shit happened to her because it opened her eyes somewhat. So, you know, that was a nice little, it wasn't like a big, you know, part of the story, but it was like a little bit of a thread running through there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I will say though that I still wish that the inciting incident, which was Sam overhearing the kidnappers, could have been done in a more believable way, because the whole time I was watching the episode, I was like, none of this would have happened if the thugs had just talked about their crime at home, and I just couldn't get over it. So, you know, maybe that's just me. I'm just saying. So episode 15 is called The Cheaters. Now, this episode was actually a little bit more horror oriented, or at least had something of a supernatural element, though a lot of the focus was still on crime, specifically people scheming to bump other people off for money. It's also like 3 or 4 stories in one, and was based on a story by famed Psycho author Robert Bloch. So at the beginning, there's this dude who's like a sorcerer, alchemist type dude. His name is Dirk Van Pryn, and he invents a pair of glasses that cause him to see something that he apparently really does not like. This something probably maybe has something to do with the truth, because he also engraved the Latin word veritas into like the frames, like the middle of it. Van Pryn subsequently commits suicide after seeing the terrible thing. So then we jump to an old junk man named Joe Henshaw, and he buys up Van Pryn's old house for $100, like at an auction, hoping that there's some valuable shit in there that he can sell for a tidy profit. Now, his wife, Maggie, gets on his ass about spending that much money on what's probably just going to be a bunch of worthless crap. And for a time, it looks like she was probably like correct about that. So when him and his assistant, Charlie, go into the old place, it's just like this completely dusty ruin with nothing particularly promising contained inside. But in a secret compartment in a desk, however, Joe finds the spectacles, and when he puts them on back home, he discovers that when you look at other people, you can tell what they're really thinking. Like, no matter what they're saying, you can kind of like read their mind, you know what I mean? So in this way, he uncovers a plot to kill him, which has been cooked up by his wife and his assistant, who are also fucking, the two of them. So shit goes drastically sideways in a way that I admit I was not expecting. So the glasses then end up in the possession of this doddering but wealthy old kleptomaniac named Miriam Alcott, and they reveal yet another murder plot by Miriam's conniving relatives who were, planning to bump her off and get her money. A lot of that going around, it seems. So after her fate plays out, the glasses fall into the hands of one of the connivers, one of the connivers who was planning to kill the old lady. And then after that, it gets falls into the grasp of like one of his party guests, who is actually a writer. And he actually brings the whole plot full circle by putting the glasses on and looking at himself instead of others. So it's coming back to like the alchemist looking at himself and like seeing a horrible yada yada. So this one was pretty fun. It's a little bit disjointed. The ending was a little bit silly and a little bit unsatisfying, and some of the acting toward the end was like way over dramatic, especially the woman that played like the writer's wife. She was just, man, she was chewing up all the scenery in that studio and probably the one next door as well. But I did like this, slightly more horror oriented story, although it almost had the weird feel of like an anthology within an anthology, because like I said, you're not following the same set of characters all the way through, really. You're just kind of jumping from like one to another, like as the glasses like move on like through all the people. So episode 16, The Hungry Glass. Now this is actually one of the best known episodes of the series, and this one was also based on a Robert Bloch short story from 1951, which was called The Hungry House. And I kind of feel like this was the first overtly horror installment since episode 7, which was The Purple Room. And not surprisingly, both that episode and this one had the same director, Douglas Hayes. So it probably goes without saying, but this was easily my favorite episode of the series so far, not only because it was this really effective, creepy ghost story, but also because it had some very familiar faces in it, including William Shatner, that's right, the Shat, Russell Johnson, aka the Professor from Gilligan's Island, and a brief appearance by Ellie Mae Clampett herself, Donna Douglas. So William Shatner plays a guy named Gil Thrasher, which is a crazy fucking name. And he has a wife named Marcia, and they have bought this old seaside mansion in a very unwelcoming New England town. The accents sound like Maine. The town is called Cape Caution. Now, the oldsters in the town's only bar, restaurant, general store, it's all those things and more, they kind of hint at some dark doings at the house, but Gil and Marcia just kind of like laugh it off, as does their new friend and out-of-town realtor, Adam Talmadge, who's played by Russell Johnson. He was the one that sold them the place. So one of the weird things about the house, it seems, they find out, is that there are no mirrors in there anywhere, which kind of causes Gil to snark that maybe the place was built by vampires. So pretty soon it becomes clear that some bizarre shit having to do with reflections is going on up there, though. At a little celebratory get-together at this house, Adam's wife, Liz, is fairly certain that she saw a man with a hook for a hand, like staring at them through the picture window, even though there's nothing but like a sheer cliff drop, like where the guy would have to be standing for her to see him there. And as time goes on, Gil, who's a photographer, he sees what appears to be like a little girl's face, like appearing in one of his photographs, where obviously it wasn't when he took the picture. And after his wife finds all of the wayward mirrors stashed in this hidden room in the attic, Gil also sees what looks like an apparition of an old woman, like with a fan. There is some ambiguity introduced about this whole thing, however, because Gil suffered like some brain fever while he was in the army in Korea, and he wonders if he's just having like a recurrence of all the hallucinations and stuff that he was having back then, because the doctors told him, oh, well, it might recur like over the next years or whatever. Now, Adam, the realtor guy, finally tells Gil that the woman that the house was built for, whose name was Laura Bellman, was so obsessed with staring at her own beauty in the house's mirrors, of which there were many, that she shut herself away in the mansion until she was found like decades later, who is a very, very old, whatever happened to Baby Jane looking woman, who still saw herself as young and gorgeous, like every time she looked at her reflection, even though, like I said, she looked like, yeah, she looked like that. So a bunch of people died in and around the house subsequently, all in supposed accidents that involved mirrors or windows somehow. So, like I said, this was a great story. Very, very atmospheric, very spooky. And I also really liked the humor to it, because there was all of this very witty, sparkling dialogue exchanges that took place between like the four principal characters before kind of started getting like scarier. I think when people look back at the Thriller series fondly, it's particularly the scarier episodes like this one that they're thinking of. And it's very, very easy to see why this one is remembered still by horror nerds like all these decades later, because this is like easily the best one that I've seen so far. So episode 17, The Poisoner. Now this episode kind of veered back toward the crime stories again, though it did have a few kind of horror-like elements since it involved a serial killer essentially, and because it was set in the 19th century, it also had a little bit of maybe like a Jack the Ripper type feel to it, just in the way that people like dressed, and it was like old cobblestone streets and lanterns and shit like that. This was also the first installment of the show, as far as I'm aware, that was actually based on a true story, though this fact wasn't really spelled out explicitly. I think I did like find what the true story was like pretty easily, like because of some stuff that Boris Karloff said at the beginning, but you know, they changed some of the names and everything, but the story is like pretty much intact. So our main character is an insufferably pompous windbag named Thomas Edward Griffith, who's played by Murray Matheson. Now, he fancies himself something of a bon vivant, if you want to call it that. You know, he's dabbling in painting and writing, and he throws these big lavish parties for, you know, the upper crust of society, all the high muckety mucks and whatnot. Now, at the beginning of the story, he marries a woman named Frances Abercrombie, believing that she is wealthy. See, old Thomas appears very rich and moves in rich people circles, but in reality, his money is held in trust by his Uncle George, who has been refusing to pay out anymore to his profligate nephew, I guess, since Thomas not only spends just oodles and oodles of cash on extravagant doodads of various kinds for his house because he's living way beyond his means. But he's also forged his uncle's signature in order to get some more money, like on at least one occasion and possibly more than that. So in desperation, Thomas marries Frances, but on their wedding day, her very kind of crass mother and sickly sister arrive, and it becomes obvious that Frances is not as wealthy as Thomas assumed. And what's worse, the mother and the sister both move into the house like, hey, here we are, like without any, any preamble. And also they bring the family kitty, which I was immediately, my stomach went, oh, something bad's going to happen to that kitty. And it does. I hate to tell you. So Thomas, after learning that the mom actually does have some money stashed away from the sale of her house, decides that he's going to, maybe help the Grim Reaper along a little bit with the use of some nameless poison that he keeps in this handy-dandy compartment, like in a jeweled ring that he has. So over the course of the story, he kills pretty much everybody who gets in his way, including indirectly the sweet kitty, which, you know how I am in cats, and it's like that just made me want to throw the smarmy asshole into a shark tank wearing a raw meat codpiece. I'm like, don't you fucking hurt that kitty. But yeah, it's so bad things happen to the cat. Just saying. But due to some very slick wordplay and some legal jiggery-pokery, he actually sort of gets away with it, at least for a little while. Now, as I alluded to earlier, Thomas Edward Griffith, the main character of this piece, was actually based on a real guy. The real guy was named Thomas Griffiths Wainwright, and he was a 19th century writer, artist, and dandy who was an irresponsible spender who indeed had a fortune that was held in trust by his uncle George. Now, several people around the real Thomas did die mysteriously, including, just like in this episode, his sister-in-law, his mother-in-law, his uncle, and a friend of his. Although several writers, including Charles Dickens and Oscar Wilde, embellished stories about him being a serial poisoner, including inventing the whole poison in the ring bit, there actually was no solid evidence that he ever killed anyone. Much like in the episode, though, he did get convicted, like, on a technicality having to do with the forgery. Like I said, he was trying to get money out of his Uncle George and forged his uncle's signature. That really did happen. And he did end up getting shipped off to a penal colony in Australia, where I believe he served, like, 10 years or something like that. Now, I read the real dude's Wikipedia page, and I realized that the actor playing him, like Murray Matheson playing him, and he plays him as, like, this really, really pretentious poser who is, like, in love with his own cleverness. And reading the real dude's Wikipedia page, I'm like, that was probably right on the money. And that was evidenced very clearly to me by this dude's literary career, in which he actually, in real life, used the pseudonyms Janice Weathercock, Egomet or Egome Bonmal, and Cornelius Van Vinkbooms. I mean, even if he didn't kill anybody, like, fuck that guy, seriously. So episode 18, Man in the Cage. This one was a little bit harder for me to get into because it's kind of focused on smuggling in Tangier, but the mystery was still pretty, like, intriguing enough to keep me interested, at least, like, through the first part. I kind of, like, my attention kind of, like, wandered a little bit after, like, through the middle part, but it was still pretty good. So this was actually based on a 1960 novel by Jack Vance, who was a very, very prolific, mystery thrillers, sci-fi, fantasy. He wrote all kind of stuff. So the story begins with an American guy named Noel Hudson who's smuggling some guns for Arab nationalists. Now, they also give him a little something extra in a couple of boxes on the truck that are labeled soap powder. Noel does not want whatever is in these boxes, but he kind of gets hastened on his way at gunpoint because, here comes the heat. Like, the patrol is, like, bearing down on them, right? So he is kind of forced to take off. Now, Noel tries to weasel out of the job, like, as he's driving away, but the guy he's with, whose name is Kazim, tries to force him to keep driving to Tangier to, like, finish the job, at which point there's kind of, like, a struggle. Kazim gets killed, and then shortly after that, Noel apparently disappears. So we then follow Noel's brother, Daryl, who comes to Morocco after he received a very troubling letter from Noel like 3 weeks previously, in which he was like asking for money. Now, Daryl sent the money, but it never got picked up, so Daryl got worried and flew to Tangier to see what the problem was. So during his stay, a whole bunch of like shady shit occurs, most of which centers around people trying to get Noel's letter away from Daryl because apparently they think there's some information in it. And Daryl also eventually finds out that the soap powder boxes contained a cool $1 million in pure heroin. So people get tortured and killed. Daryl is very briefly shoved into a cage, hence the title, even though he escapes like within a minute or two. And it's all seemingly because Noel's employers believe that Daryl knows where both Noel and the stash of heroin is. Meanwhile, kind of Daryl is conducting his own investigation into trying to figure out what ultimately happened to his brother. Now, as I said, this one didn't really grab me as much as some of the others. International drug smuggling intrigue isn't usually high on my list of fascinating story topics, but this one was still pretty good. It didn't really, again, have any compelling twists and turns. It was very, very straightforward crime tale, and it's like, there weren't really any surprises in store. Oh, fun fact, the kid who plays the thief Slip in this episode is actually Barry Gordon, who would go on to do tons of voice acting and is probably best known as the original voice of Donatello and Bebop in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And it's like, I love finding out little nuggets of information like that, because like I said, when I recognize actors or when I'm looking at the synopsis, like on Wikipedia, and I click on all the directors and the writers and the actors just to see like what else they've done. And a lot of times, like I'll recognize them and be like, oh yeah, that's right, I recognize that person. What else were they in? So that's how I found out about that. So I thought that was kind of neat. So thanks for tuning in to this installment. Keep watching this space. I'll probably get around to reviewing the next episodes, next 6 episodes sometime in November. Remember to like and share if you enjoyed the content, and please subscribe to Scare Salon if you haven't already. Also go check out the website scaresalon.com, where there's a bunch more like written content about books and movies and stuff like that. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.